Hi, this is Paul. When Algo served up for me a conversation between Peter Williams and Tom Holland, I thought Bethel McGrew's dream has come true. Because for years, Bethel, although a huge fan of Tom Holland's, frustrated with some of the things that Tom Holland continues to say in terms of skepticism about let's just use the common modern language of historicity and certain elements of the gospel, in particular the nativity narratives. And over the last few years, and the rest is history. Tom and Dominic, Tom has expressed his thoughts, and Peter Williams has done a lot of work on this. As at the beginning of the video, he talks about first he got his degree in Old Testament, and then he went to New Testament. And so this is all part of sort of this modernist apologetic battlefield of how far can we trust in sort of a correspondence view of truth and language. How far can we get with the canonical gospels, and how far should we trust them? Now, the heyday of this has obviously been sort of in this modernist approach, and those who've listened to my channel long enough know that I think this the heyday of this approach has passed. And I don't know how much it matters for people and how much they care about these issues. Some certainly do. There's always legacy and lag with these kinds of transformations. And in some ways, Peter Williams is sort of taking the traditional position. And one of the things that struck me as I listened to this video was how often he does sound like a Christian from church, and how often Tom Holland sounds like someone who's working these things through. But Tom Holland is sort of someone in process here still. And he's got questions about elements of the narratives. When was the census? And if you've read, depending on if you're a Christian minister and you regularly prepare Christmas sermons, and you open up the commentaries, all of these debates have been around for a long time. And so if you're coming to this video to hear where Paul stands, you might as well click away now, because that's not what interests me about this video. There are plenty of places that you can go to sort of line up the evidence here and there about what to believe and what shouldn't, even though, as I think Peter Williams nicely said in this video, scholarship continues to move on this, because that's what scholars do. I am more interested in, let's say, the state of play of what is happening in these conversations. So I'm going to pick it up here with Tom Holland talking.
I mean, I think you can sense in the Gospels a very coherent sense of what Jesus thinks is going on and what his role is. And his role is to proclaim the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God. And what the kingdom of God exactly is kind of mysterious in the Gospels. But clearly what it is not is something that has any truck with the temple cult of the Judeans or the temple cult of the Romans. Jesus,
right there already, there is certainly commonality between the Judeans and the Romans with respect to their approach to the temple. I will not argue that there isn't commonality, but Jesus' relationship with the temple cult in Judea would be very, very different from, let's say, his relation. It would be obviously very interesting to say, transport Jesus to Athens and see what he would say to that. Of course, we get what Paul says about that. And I think that's helpful to hear from Paul. But right away, okay. Keep going, Tom.
Is equally silent before the Sanhedrin and before Pilate. And he rejects.
That is such an interesting point. And again, this was part of the reason I know some people get frustrated with me about this, but I don't, when I watch Jordan Peterson do his thing on the Bible, I, certainly have my yeah buts, just like I had with respect to what Tom Holland first said. But then they sometimes say things that are like, oh, yeah, that's right. And that's really interesting. And that's going to make me think about this. Because, of course, I think I just finished my rough draft for Sunday, the entire set and setting of Jesus in Jerusalem engaging the hierarchy around the temple, and that is such a complex picture that we only know so much about. Again, if it weren't for Josephus, who comes up a fair amount in this video, we would really be sort of lost. And now, of course, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, so we know something about this. But that itself is a complex group of characters. And Jesus' relationship with the temple is so interesting. I've touched on this in some of my recent sermons too, because of course, I think right from the start, there are certain built-in ambiguities with the religion of Israel and the temple. And they already show up. They show up in the book of Samuel, where David is ready to build the temple, and first Nathan gives him the thumbs up, go ahead, and then Nathan pulls back and says no. And it's left a little murky in Samuel. By Kings and Chronicles, you tend to get, well, the Lord was waiting for Solomon, and Kings and Chronicles are quite a bit more chipper about the temple. But the temple will be a complex thing because on one hand, it sort of focuses and localizes the cult of Israel into one place, which will be extremely important for when the temple is destroyed and then synagogue worship develops, et cetera, et cetera. And this shift from sacrifices to obedience of Torah, which is already sort of pre-seen in the prophets. Obedience is more important than sacrifices. And I can point to John Walton's book. I point this out in numerous of my sermons. John Walton's study about contrasting like and unlike comparisons between Israelite religion and other ancient Near East prophetic traditions, how in the other traditions, the sacrifices themselves were of primary importance. And you see this broadening that happens in Israel's covenant with God and the importance of the obedience to the covenant, not just the compliance with the demanded sacrificial system. So, and into that complexity walks Jesus. And the only hint of violence we ever see Jesus perpetrate has to do with the temple and the destruction of the temple. And in fact, I, again, preached on John 1 a few weeks ago. Jesus says to his debaters in Jerusalem, destroy this temple, command, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again. Now, of course, this is part of the Johannine complex. Jesus says something that's ambiguous, and his interlocutors take it the wrong way, giving Jesus the opportunity to take it the other way. You have this heaven and earth dichotomy with Nicodemus must be born of wind and of water and spirit, water below, spirit above. You have Genesis 1. Genesis 1 just pervades these early chapters of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. So the temple, it has a different valence, and that in fact eventually Sam Tiedemann was like, get Tom Holland to do a series on Constantine. I thought, yeah, that would be excellent. I would love the rest of this history to do a series on Constantine. So you've got this this ambiguity with Israel and the temple that I don't think is with the other kingdoms. And of course, through Christianity, through the destruction of the temple, this then will yield this transformation that evolves into the church. And of course, that's a whole nother conversation in terms of structure of the church and liturgies and Eastern liturgy and Latin liturgy and all of that. But Tom's point here about the silence is interesting, because I think part of what we see happening, I've been preaching through the Gospel of John this season, is it's very clear in the Gospel of John that the teams want Jesus on their side, and Jesus says basically, I will be on no side but mine, and you're on my side or you're not. Now, he can be very generous. Of course, you've got the Samaritan woman, you've got the royal official at Cana, but in Jerusalem, Jesus is in some ways finds a lot of resistance, and sometimes is most hard-lined in Jerusalem. So this is all really complex.
The claim of both of them to be the representatives of a divine order that is manifest in earthly power. And I think it's that sense of a kind of division between the world of God, the world of Caesar, the world of the temple, that is so radical and so full of potential for the future. And I think that in that sense, he is properly proclaiming a radical sea shift in the way that certainly people in the Christian world will come to conceptualize pretty much everything. And that is a really, really profound sense that you don't have to believe that he's the Son of God to recognize that he is preaching something that is seismic in its implications. But I mean, just to go back to Augustus.
So he's basically making the point from a secular posture that, and again, this is what's so helpful to listen to some of these characters who are coming at it not sort of through the church. That's where Peter Williams and I are sort of trained, but of course we sort of have blinkers because it's the usual arguments that go through, and Tom's looking at it from sort of a fresh perspective. And he's right in that for the next few centuries, there's going to be a seismic shift in what we would call the practices of religion in the Roman Empire. And Jesus is at the heart of this. And I would argue that Jesus' posture towards the temple is at the heart of this, with the cleansing of the temple, the challenge to destroy this temple, and I'll raise it up in 3 days. Jesus sort of saying, in my body, I will fulfill what the temple was always pointing to. And a la C.S. Lewis and Dreams, Good Dreams, perhaps the other temples. You can't understand the temple in Jerusalem without understanding the function of other temples. You can read about these kinds of things in scholars like John Walton. So there's definite connection, but Jesus will sort of fulfill this. And of course, through synagogues and then churches, all of this is going to change, and the entire Roman world is going to change. And the pagan assumptions that had dominated the world, not just the Mediterranean. I mean, of course, the Vikings are going to come headlong into this because there's sort of a common paganism that has great commonalities around the world, and Christianity is going to overthrow it. And in some ways, even in the echoes of the Protestant Reformation, we're still dealing with elements of that overthrow.
Augustus also, hit the idea of his divinity and the divinity of Caesar. I mean, that is also kind of quite radical in the context of the Roman world, because it's making manifest in a way that people can perhaps instinctively understand the process of change from a republican system of government to an autocratic imperial system of government. And so again, you can see how at exactly the same time.
And again, I mean, because I've been doing so much work on monarchy versus republic lately, 19th century history, now lately looking at Iranian history, or the history of the Iranian Revolution, I had never sort of framed it in that way, but Tom doing that is really helpful.
That the Gospels and Paul's letters and so on are preaching a recalibration of how believers in Christ should understand society, humanity, and the relationship of the earthly to the divine. In the Roman imperial context, the stories of the divinization of Julius Caesar and of Augustus, and in due course of Claudius, are likewise channeling profound changes in the way that the Roman world functions and how people understand the society in which Romans live.
Another Peter who asks this question: doesn't this entire discussion hang upon whether or not there's a supernatural realm? Peter, how do you defend it? Tom?
Now, anybody who's watched my channel long enough knows I don't like that word supernatural. I think it sends us in a wrong direction. And that doesn't mean that the ancient people didn't understand sort of normal life and moments when divine power shows up. But when we frame it as supernatural, I think it just gets us going in the wrong direction. Now, again, part of what's a little annoying about this, especially now, I like Justin and I like Tom. Justin was formed on unbelievable, and often when Justin and Tom get together, Justin is just playing this. Tom's been very gracious, because I would probably, well, you know me, I've got too much of a troll in me. Justin is always just sort of, let's see how much we can prod Tom and get Tom to say, and anyway, let's let Peter answer the question.
What's your view on it? I'll start with you, Peter.
Well, obviously, your prior beliefs, what you believe about the world, is going to have a big effect on what you believe is possible. So when you are open to the supernatural...
And I'm super glad he said it that way, because I don't think the way this stuff is framed by Christians, I think doesn't help us. I think it doesn't help us because it is all in this, are supernatural things possible? And you're sort of already selling out before the conversation begins, because you're already basically saying, we all know what normality looks like. These things are abnormal. Is the abnormal possible? And what he says right there is, I don't think we care about that in the abstract. And I think, again, unless you're really blinkered by what our culture has done, everybody else in the world seems to know what the people in the Bible knew, which was that unusual things really do happen, but it's good to be skeptical about them because they're rare. and so whenever someone coming along with a cheap story about some what we would call supernatural or some extraordinary, in the DR we'd use the word manifestation, when some manifestation comes along, that we're just going to believe it. Now, I think C.S. Lewis is helpful when he uses sort of the Lucy challenge, when he says, is Lucy a liar? No. Peter says. Peter, Edmund, Susan, Lucy, just got to remember. Peter says, no, she's not unreliable. Well, then why do you think she's lying? Now, she could be mistaken. She could be, mistaken about what she's seen, but it's a pretty big thing. The world on the other side of the wardrobe. And so normal people weigh these kinds of things. And you don't have to go to special places to notice unusual things that happen in the world. And there's framing, there's all these kinds of things around it. But I think Peter is right in that I think what really concerns people is, could this happen to me? And I think you can see that somewhat in the whole Scott Adams episode, where Scott Adams, a skeptic, but could I wake up in heaven? Is there an afterlife? And, you know, he decides to sort of take a chance. And I was talking to someone who watched a lot more of those last few months with Scott Adams and watched the Celebration of Life, which I haven't watched yet, and said some really interesting things. So maybe I'll cover that. But maybe I should look for it now. All right, this is Scott Adams' biographer.
God gave us our voices back. He changed that reality. Of course, the physical world still exists. You might say, what good is a filter against something like cancer? But look around us. Have you ever seen anyone leave this world surrounded by so much love? By facing death in the public way he did, Scott became even closer to the people who loved him. Scott reframed death as not just a physical separation, but also an opportunity for connection. He told me after he could no longer walk that in some ways it was the worst time of his life, but in many ways it was also the best. 2 days before he died, I sent Scott a photo of the first page of his biography. His last words to me were, "And so it begins. Good luck, my friend." Even in the end, Scott saw a beginning. Scott embraced Christianity in his last days. He promised his followers he would do it. In fact, he had done it already, privately. It was the one thing he had kept to himself. He reasoned that if he was wrong, no loss. If he reached heaven, he would know he had been right. Now, finally, well, the best news some of us have ever heard. Are you ready? The morning after he died, one of his friends, who is not religious, sent me a note. "Joel," he wrote, "I woke up this morning with a 3-word phrase in my head. Incredibly good news." Just the phrase. And no linkage to Scott until I asked myself, incredible good news about what? And then I tried to dismiss it, but I couldn't. I didn't really ask for any messages, but this one arrived. Incredibly good news. What does that mean? As Scott said, we each understand news through our own filters. But if you have a certain filter, call it the salvation filter, what I just told you may be the best news you have ever heard. Is it real? Was it Scott? I can't tell you. What I can tell you is how beautiful it is that millions of people who love Scott can look forward to having coffee with him again. For now, we can pass along Scott's lessons to the people we will one day leave behind, to keep him alive in this world as well. So it begins. Good luck, my friend.
Yeah, is that something? Is that a nothing? So much in this world is like that. And the question isn't, is it in the abstract? Is it, what about for me?
Particularly if obviously your prior beliefs, what you believe about the world, is going to have a big effect on what you believe is possible. So when you are open to the supernatural, particularly if you believe that God's already done amazing things, say in the Old Testament, the idea that he might raise his son from the dead in the New Testament isn't asking you to believe something qualitatively different. So I think, yes, a lot depends on your overall view on things. I think it is possible to have your foot in two camps and to be comparing two very contrasting approaches to making sense of everything simultaneously and to look inside and out of them.
Do you ever feel like you have a foot in both camps, Tom?
I feel like I have, well, I've only got 2 feet, but if I feel like I've got multiple feet in multiple camps. The kind of the dream of writing history is to be objective and neutral, I guess. I mean, that's been since the Enlightenment, that's been the model. And when I came to write the book I wrote about Islam, which was also about religion and monotheism in late antiquity, so it was also about Talmudic Judaism and Christianity and Zoroastrianism and all kinds of things as well. I did it as someone who didn't believe in God, who didn't think that God, for instance, had spoken to Muhammad, didn't think the Quran came from God. And I felt that that made me therefore more objective than, say, Muslim scholars who did think that that was an explanation for the Quran. But I realized, of course, while writing it, just how arrogant a perspective that was, that my presuppositions and assumptions were just as much a faith position as that of a believing Muslim. And I remember doing an event, and there was a Muslim woman in the audience, and she asked me about why have you written this book about Islam, which essentially you're questioning all kinds of things that are incredibly important to me, that's central to my understanding of how the universe functions and my place within it. And you would never do this to your own belief system. And I really felt the sting and force of that. And actually, I was at that process in the, starting to question my own belief system, which I was coming to realize was essentially a kind of very milky tea form of Christianity. That what I had thought was, that I'd emancipated myself from superstition, and that I just had to look into my heart and I would know what was right. That actually I was just doing what Paul was doing. And that's how I came to write Dominion, was it kind of acknowledgement of the fact that my soggy humanist agnosticism was itself contingent, was itself a faith position. And I guess that the realization of that has made me worry that to cling too dogmatically to a kind of skepticism about the dimension of the supernatural is to cut yourself off as a materialist in the 21st century from how the vast majority of human beings across the world and through the sweep of time have thought, because we are the ones in the 21st century West who are unusual. And so now, whenever I look at different periods of time in different places, I try and imagine that I'm trying to imagine myself into not just believing in the supernatural, because that makes it sound like the supernatural is something distinct from the material, that the supernatural is it's like the milk in the tea. You can't separate it out. So whether that's ancient Athens or whether it's 15th century France or whatever, that's what I'm trying, I guess, to think myself into. And because I recognize that culturally in all kinds of ways, my gut assumptions are Christian, I am interested in, dare I say, sacralizing them, in kind of breathing the life of the supernatural back into them and seeing what happens. And it just makes things more interesting. And
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because inevitably, at the core of this conversation, I think there is this back and forth between the sort of objective historical inquiry with your historian hat on, Tom, and the fact that you've spoken openly about the fact you do have, an increasing draw towards faith in some sense.
It's either all or nothing for me.
Okay.
It's either the Nietzschean abyss or the experience of Marian visitations.
Okay.
I'm not.
You can look up if you search YouTube Tom Holland Marian Vision, you'll find him talking to Justin Brierley about this experience. He was having a cancer scare and he was in a church and he had a Marian manifestation.
Not interested in being a soggy centrist anymore.
No, all or nothing. Well, in that vein, coming again to this question of history versus faith and so on, someone asks, is there enough evidence to say Jesus rose from the dead? And there's other similar questions asking, to what extent can we use historical methods to point towards an obviously supernatural?
And again, whenever this question is asked, I don't believe it's asked. Well, what is behind that question? Behind that question is sort of the question, could this happen? How much do you really care? What you probably want to know, sort of like Scott Adams is this something that I can participate in? Is this something that could be true for me? Could I rise from the dead? Is that box 6 feet under the end of the story and just the big null? That's what you want to know. Why put it out there?
Event like that. I'll start with you, Peter.
So I would say there is evidence, strong evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. I don't think it's coercive evidence. And
I really liked how he used that word, coercive evidence. I hadn't really heard someone use it that way before, but and even so, I love the use of that word, because just go ahead and coerce someone to acknowledge whether or not they believe it or not. That's between their ears, and you probably don't know what they honestly are thinking. If they've got reason to say a certain thing because it either gains them status or loses them status or might lose them their job or something like that. There's all kinds of things that go here. But a lot of people will, even in very coercive settings, not acknowledge things that everybody else knows. I did not sleep with that woman.
we have, even within the gospel accounts, the way things are often not coercive. I mean, the story in Luke of Christ being on the cross, two criminals either side of him seeing exactly the same thing and having two different reactions. So I think what I'd say is, for me, the fact that there are clearly lots of people believe they saw Jesus risen from the dead early on. 1 Corinthians 15, Galatians, other parts of Paul clearly show belief in the resurrection is an early thing. Then you have a missing body, and it's not just a missing body of any old person, it's the fact that this same person also has the most genius sayings, the most genius stories, is believed to, comes from a remarkable people group, dies at a remarkable time, has a remarkable day, and you just list all of these things. And so it's the fact that it just doesn't happen to someone random from Huddersfield, if you excuse me, anyone.
Nothing against Huddersfield. But...
No. So that's what I'd say. Those things come together and they make a pattern. And so when I would argue for the resurrection, I'm not asking for people to believe in a weird paranormal thing. I'm asking for people to embrace the fact that, as I see it.
And again, I really like that he dropped the word paranormal, because when you start talking supernatural, you sort of place people in, well, well, did you like the show? How many seasons of Supernatural were there? I never watched it. Some of my kids watch it, like 16 seasons of Supernatural, and so now, paranormal. What Tom had said earlier about the ancient people did not conceptualize it. They understood, let's say the rules of the world above and the world below and the frame of the gods and all that. They understood those distinctions, but again, it was infused. It was always present. And so when Jesus says the kingdom of God is at hand, and he does these signs, he does these miracles, well, the presence of the miracles in their midst is reinforcing the idea that this power is not just available in the abstract. And so then when, again, I'm just preaching on John 4 and 5, the royal official's son who is ill, I need to know if that power is available for my son. That's what I need to know, because he's my son.
Miracles around Jesus make a pattern. There's actually a new pattern emerging, rather than it's just an anomaly to the normally pattern-formed Christian.
And if you want to read a treatment of that patterns, pick up C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, because he talks about miracles of the old creation, miracles of the new creation. And C.S. Lewis sort of nicely walks through what are the patterns of these miracles and how do those patterns relate to the normal patterns of our lives.
Of life.
What's your perspective on this idea that history could be used at some sense to at least suggest that something supernatural was actually at the core of that? Or do you feel that's just ruled out to some extent by the historical method?
Well, it's just that, okay, you're asking him about the past. I mean, he just finished saying it's all or nothing. I don't want in the middle. I mean, you go back to my conversation with him when I was in England in 2022. He talks about the word of the day, and he doesn't want that. He's looking for, he wants the inbreaking of God in his life. And so, buckle up, Buttercup. I mean, God can play rough.
It's ruled out by the evidence of the Gospels themselves, which clearly integrate within their narratives the possibility of disbelief and miscomprehension. Mary sees the risen Christ and mistakes him for the gardener. The guards are there because the possibility that people might come and steal the body is something that the authorities are worried about. So the explanations that...
And a point that I make almost every Easter Sunday morning, the women are going there to finish the embalming, and all of the disciples that were told on the third day, none of them show up. You'd think they'd have a little cake and welcome back, Jesus, woohoo, party favors. No, nothing. Nobody buys it. And, you can find me preaching about this all the time. When Jesus, says, okay, Gospel of Luke, we're on the road down to Jerusalem, and this is what's going to happen, and probably turned over into the hand of Gentiles and crucified. It's sort of like when the cop shows up at the door and you go into shock. It's like, no! I mean, what? For resurrection? That's at the end of time.
People subsequently have made to explain away what happened to the body or who the risen Jesus was, are there in the Gospels. The possibility that, Mary and the disciples mistook Jesus for someone else, or the fact that perhaps the body was taken by interested parties, is there in the Gospels. And again, it's part of this message that, in a sense, there are dramatic, in the opinion of the Gospel writers and of the early Christians, you will feel it in your heart. If you don't witness the risen Christ yourself, maybe he'll appear to you on the road to Damascus. But there are lots of people, obviously, who don't think that Jesus rose from the dead, because otherwise the world would have become Christian within a year.
Well,
it doesn't. Because there are all kinds of people who think it's nonsense and who continue to think it's nonsense for centuries and centuries, right the way up to the present day.
But nonetheless, you also said earlier that you do think that those first followers who did claim to have seen the risen Christ were telling the truth. They really did believe they had seen.
But Paul, for instance, is preaching the need. You need to feel it in your heart.
Right. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I take it that Paul believes in a bodily resurrection because his argument in Romans is this has an effect for your mortal bodies and you're physically going to be resurrected. So I take it that he doesn't just believe in a sort of spiritual resurrection. But Tom's quite right. There's a lot of doubt going on in the resurrection narratives, not just in John's Gospel, we got doubting Thomas, but also in Luke, where Jesus says, don't doubt, to the disciples. And Matthew, he's building up to this climax, the Great Commission, 4 verses from finishing his Gospel. And he says they saw him, and when they saw, some doubted. And it's like, dude, that's not how you build up to a climax. That's really anticlimactic. And so the fact that you've got this as part of the Gospel narratives means there's no embarrassment there about the idea that there's doubt. But there is this constant theme in all of the early Christian writings and since of Christians using evidence, not necessarily saying we're doing the discipline of history, but using rational arguments that are related to how we evidentially approach the past and saying that is relevant and it comes together and it does point to something remarkable going on that you can respond to.
Well, this leads us nicely into another question here. Someone points out that Tom said earlier, if it were clear that Jesus was God or Jesus was raised from the dead, there wouldn't be any need for faith. And so they ask Peter, well, what is faith? Is it some sort of alternative to knowledge or historical evidence?
So I would say I like the word trust, because I think that faith, coming from Latin fides.
And I'm so glad he's framing it that way, because it's the better way to frame it.
was more like that. So now faith in the last couple of hundred years can be a belief without any evidence. And I don't think that's what's going on in the Bible. When in the early passages with Abraham having faith in God, God is actually appearing to him at the time. So there's a sort of relational contact, and then God's asking for more. So I think it's this relational future trust in God. And I would just say that I think humans are built very relationally. In our mother's womb, we are getting fed nutrients and information simultaneously. And the idea that we can then at some later stage become a brain in a vat, or disregard all the human relationships through which we receive information and testimony, I don't think is right. So I think faith is a rational response to our Maker. It's future trust, but based on things that are already being shown to us.
And I know a bunch of people have said, you really need to treat the Bishop Barron and Ross Douthat conversation, and that's still in the back of my mind. I might, but I'm listening along to that one, and Bishop Barron pulls out the it didn't start with me. Dorothy Sayers, C.S. Lewis gets it from Dorothy Sayers, kind of the author and the character image in terms of the relationship between God and this world. And Bishop Barron pulls out Tolkien. It's like, I was tempted at that moment to make a trollish video of how many times in the last 8 years I've made that point, and here he's taking it from me. Of course, Bishop Barron just didn't watch my channel and steal it from me. It's just such an obvious thing that what we've seen among the new atheists and among many people today is that they imagine that God is a super thing in the sky. And if you simply ask the question, where could Frodo find Tolkien in Middle-earth? On one hand, or let's have Aragorn looking. He's a little bit more capable of wandering around. Aragorn was, ranger. He's wandering around Middle-earth. Where could Aragorn find Tolkien in Middle-earth? In some ways, Tolkien is everywhere in Middle-earth. He's all over the place, but you can't locate him like you can locate the Ring or locate the hobbits or locate the elves. It's not that kind of relationship. And I really liked Peter Williams' answer there, because finally, and I was just, again, I've just preached in this. Jesus leaves Samaria and he arrives at Cana again, and there's a royal official's son. And first thing Jesus says to him, Jesus told him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe. And again, the truth is that people see plenty of signs and wonders, and it doesn't necessarily make them people of faith. And you find this again and again in the Gospels. Well, nobody sees more signs and wonders than Jesus' apostles. And when they see one, that belief seems to sort of evaporate from them. And so Jesus will say, you have little faith. I've done all these things in front of you. That's not going to make a difference. And it's not unusual to see that in pastoral ministry either, that someone's in the church and they've a big crisis and we're all in prayer, and then a miracle happens. Well, you consider it a miracle. The cancer goes away, or the surgery is successful, or a mysterious gift comes and they're bailed out of something financially, and they're just filled with enthusiasm and gratitude and faith for about as long as the hormone surge, which isn't very long. And then the next crisis comes and they're just as fraught and anxious and worried as they were in the first crisis. You could say, yeah, but you remember how God bailed you out? But I don't think he'll bail me out now. Oh, okay. Well, that's obviously from your response, and maybe he won't. But the point is that these things don't necessarily produce faith. So this royal official comes. Jesus says this rather off-putting thing to him, and this isn't unusual for Jesus. Jesus will sometimes say the most off-putting things to people coming, looking to him for help, and I wonder sometimes if it isn't just a test. It's like, all right, I'm going to say something a little off-putting for you. How bad do you want this? Fight me for it. Don't let me blow you off. Challenge me. Believe in me strong enough that you're just going to keep at it. Luke 18, persistent widow. The royal official said, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Now, of course, later on in the Gospel of John, Mary and Martha, "Come down before Lazarus dies." And then when Lazarus dies, Martha says, "If only you had been here. You let him die. What kind of friend are you?" Many Christians feel that. "Go," Jesus replied, "your son will live." Okay, now, can Jesus do miracles? Well, if he didn't believe that there was at least a possibility that royal official would not be in Cana looking for Jesus. So already faith has been exhibited. And Jesus sort of holds him back and says these words that might have put him off. And it's like, "I'm not going to be put off. My son is about to die, and I'm going to cling to you until you do it." So Jesus, go. Oh, you're not going to go and wave your hands or do some big show or something like this? The man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that the boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said, "Yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him." Then the man realized that this was the exact time which Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." So he and his whole household believed. It's just an echo of the Samaritan woman's story, where the Samaritan woman leads her entire village who had ostracized her into faith. And you can listen to that. The rough draft is coming for that, and as out for that. And by the time I release this, the sermon might be out from that too, the sermon that I preached last week at church. This is the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Galilee. But, what you'll see in the Gospels is that, no, lots of people, they'll see plenty of things and they won't believe, because what does it mean to believe? It means to, and Jesus is really hard on people. "Oh, you're a prophet." I'm not settling for prophet here, people. You've had lots of prophets. Do I have a prophetic vocation? Certainly. But I'm way more than a prophet.
Does that make sense to you, Tom?
I mean, I think I would frame it slightly differently for what it's worth, which is that seen from the most objective materialist, skeptical perspective, it is clear that there is something in our brain chemicals that make us, as human beings, experience a sense of the supernatural, kind of yearn for a sense of the divine. And we as a society are probably the first that has kind of conditioned ourselves not to do that, and perhaps to kind of feel to mistrust it and to regard it with suspicion. But I think that it is clearly seen in the broad context of history, something that is instinctive to us as a species. And again, to be kind of Darwinian about it, survival of the fittest. I know he didn't coin that phrase, but let's use that as shorthand. I mean, of all the ways all the ways that have emerged over the course of human history to satisfy that urge, Christianity is the most successful. So it does suggest, purely in base Darwinian terms, that it has, basically it's beaten the competitors. Although obviously Islam may have something to say about that. It's, that race isn't over by any means. But studied purely objectively, Christianity is the most successful way that humans have devised to explain what their purpose is.
Right. I suppose that then raises the question, though, naturally, of is it just really successful because it's evolutionarily useful versus it being,
well, right.
supernatural?
I mean, it's kind of like those drawings where it's either a rabbit or a duck. It's difficult to hold them both in your head at the same time. Is Christianity successful because it's true, or is Christianity successful because it's it's hit on some formula?
It does.
And it's so funny because, well, when it's true, okay, well, where does that category lie? Just kind of out there in the abstract. And how we live, well, whether we believe it is demonstrated by how we live more than what we say.
There's a question here that basically reflects this, so we can continue the conversation. Someone says, is it possible to separate the supernatural elements of Christianity from its cultural and moral influences? Does just being a cultural Christian make sense? I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
So the very, very best thing about Christianity is Jesus. Okay, so you're missing out on that. You're missing out on a lot. But obviously, I think it would be far better to be a cultural Christian, acknowledging that there's a lot of wisdom in the teachings of Christianity, than not to be. But the very best thing would be actually to partake of a relationship with Jesus. That is the best. And it's on off.
Well, I mean, I think basically that most of us in this country are cultural Christian, just instinctively. And I think there is no one who's more culturally Christian than the atheist who says, I don't need
Richard Dawkins.
some, Bronze Age sky fairy telling me how to behave, because I just know how to behave. I'm a good person. I don't need the Bible to tell me to care for the weak and the poor and the refugee. Manifesting the fact that they are the result of centuries worth of biblical weathering. So in a sense, to be a cultural Christian is still to believe stuff. It's still to believe stuff that to, say, a Roman, a pre-Christian Roman, would have seemed mad and not at all self-evident.
Let's move to some specifically historical questions, because a lot of those are here as well. We've been talking about the Gospels a lot this evening. Someone asked, can Christians actually trust the people who decided which books should be in the Bible? And should Christians read books that were not chosen? Peter, do you want to start?
Well, the second question is easy. Yeah, read loads of books. But in terms of the four Gospels are the four earliest and qualitatively best in terms of their knowledge base and so on. But also say that this idea,
And this is a great answer. You can watch it on your own. I'm running out of time. Basically, there's a big fix, and mean people jiggered it so that it got the outcome they wanted. And it's like, is that really how people work?
Your sense of why these four Gospels made it in versus the many other.
Now, when I say that, it isn't that people don't always try to jigger things to get the outcomes they want. It's that even with the jiggered thing, you seldom get the outcome you want. And it's as if, on one hand, you argue that, well, it's all sort of random. People read the Bible and come up with all kinds of different answers. Oh, out of that book that you thought was jiggered so that the people who designed it got what they wanted out of it.
Contenders.
Well, I mean, when I was a teenager and reading the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which is inspiration for the Da Vinci Code, I was all over the idea that, the boring stiffs who'd frozen out all the groovy Gospels with, Jesus marrying Mary Magdalene and
Taking mushrooms
and all that kind of stuff. And obviously the reason that they'd been frozen out is because the boring squares had organized it. But I feel that's not an entirely accurate perspective of what happened. So essentially, the reason that we have the four canonical Gospels is because it was a response to a guy called Marcion, who was a shipping magnate from the Black Sea, who felt something that I'm sure lots of people who are Christians have often felt. I mean, it seems to me that the contemporary church is quite Marcionite, in that it doesn't really know what to do with the Old Testament. And Marcion's feeling was that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament were clearly so different that they couldn't be the same God. And so he...
Up. Wait. There's our boy Nate. Nathan Orman, he's right there. There he is, right there. Looking, there's our boy Nate. I forget this guy's name. He's a YouTuber, and he's Cassidy. He's gonna be at a Breakwater conference, and I might meet him at the Breakwater conference. But there's our boy Nathan. Nathan. When I got spotted in the stands in London at ARC, I'm hard to miss. I'm hard to miss. And I don't mean that because of my dashing good looks. I mean it because of my size and my the volume if I open my mouth. But there's our boy Nate. Woohoo!
And so he Luke's Gospel, Acts of the Apostles, and 3 of his letters or something.
he has some of Paul.
Some of Paul's letters. And he says, this is basically all we need. Everything else is rubbish. And this is a massive challenge because nobody had thought to, because a canon means a measuring stick in Greek. So you measure out which are the correct things to have. And no one had really thought of compiling a canon before. But there's a sense of panic on the part of what I think you can call what the great church, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church. I mean, the sense that there is a mass body of Christians who feel the challenge that Marcion is presenting to them, and who essentially get together and say, well, what are we going to do about this? And the first crucial decision they take is that there is an Old Testament and there is a New Testament. And that's where the idea, that you pair the two. They're not jettisoning the idea that the God of the Old Testament is somehow different from the God of the New Testament, which is obviously fundamental to the development of Christian orthodoxy. But they also say, okay, what are the earliest, the best, the most authenticated gospel?
Well, and the point he's making here too, I mean, you can go back through modern scholarship, and one of the questions has been, how do these things connect, and can you understand it? With what background, with what foil can you understand Jesus? And eventually, even in much more contemporary arguments, people are like, you just have to understand Jesus in the Second Temple context of Judea and Galilee, in the context of this entire sweep of Israel. I mean, read N.T. Wright's magnum opus on that.
And in a sense, biblical, New Testament scholarship is beginning with this. They're deliberately stress testing which are the most authentic accounts. And all these all the Gnostic gospels that then start to emerge, they're basically very snobbish. They're intellectually snobbish. They're essentially saying, you have to have an equivalent of a PhD to understand what God's purpose is, which is why intellectuals love them so much. But the key thing about the four Gospels is that they contain all these potential theological riches. I mean, they have been the great motor for Christian theology as it's evolved. But it is also incredibly comprehensible. That's the power of the parables. It's the power of the nativity. And you get it in Oregon, this great Christian scholar in Alexandria in the early 3rd century who is steeped in Greek philosophy. He speaks Hebrew. He's incredibly intellectual. But he says, sometimes I contemplate, the Christ child drinking his mother's milk, and I fall down and I'm struck dumb with wonder that this could be such a thing. And he's feeling wonder at exactly something that, an illiterate scullery.
Oh, look who else is in the stands. My goodness. It's just, do they not have amusements and entertainments that they're going to go listen to? Of course, Alex O'Connor is there too. And you got to know that the little camera people, they're looking for the YouTube celebrities. And let's get the YouTube celebrities in the picture, shall we?
Made, or a peasant out in the fields might also feel wonder at. And that, I think, is the genius of those Gospels, is that they make sense in terms of story. And again, to say that is to realize how culturally determined our sense of the sacred is, because there are Muslim scholars, very few of them, because most Muslim scholars regard the Gospels as they've been tampered with by Christians who want to disguise the fact that Jesus was actually a Muslim and wasn't crucified. But those who do read it, they say, what is going on here? It's just a load of stories. You don't get that in the Quran. The Quran has kind of almost banished narrative from its fabric. And then they're reading all this stuff about, people being mugged on roads and virgins who were misbehaving, and what the hell's going on here? But in terms of how the Gospels have manifested themselves over the course of 2,000 years, it's the fact that those narratives are so potent and powerful that does so much to explain the power of Christianity, I think. Whereas in the Gnostic Gospels, it's all blur.
One more question on the Gospels before we have to start wrapping this up. One person says, this was a popular question, 40 years after Jesus' death is still kind of a long time. Why didn't the authors write the Gospels 5 years after his death?
So I'd say the Gospels are close enough to the events to be right and far enough away to be wrong. Yeah, on timing, at Tom's point, people can say the wrong thing about what happened today. I don't give dates to the Gospels, but they've got names on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And because Mark and Luke are not said to be eyewitnesses, and wouldn't be famous if it weren't for the Gospels, there's no reason anyone to put those names on.
All right. Great conversation. Listen to it. Start a video. Maybe I should have done the first half of the video. I don't know. But anyway, this is the video you get. But we got Sarah Boy Nathan. How good is that? That's really good. That's what I watch these things for. I just want to see my friends on TV. So leave a comment.